And today, Phil wanted to talk
Mm-hmm.
H.P. Lovecraft, among other things. So I
Yeah.
thought maybe what we do, Phil, is just let you take it away today. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
We're recording now, Dan.
So we're recording now, and what I'm going to have is at a certain point, Catherine Courier, retired library director at the Rice Lake campus, is going to read something that I sent you. But something got me just charged over the last few days. And remember, there was a phone call where, we were actually talking about something else, and I was thinking about the first program we did, covert threats, covert existential threats.
Yep.
And then, but there was no Ukrainian war at that point. And then I realized that what I was seeing was that which was covert was manifesting. So I thought about this in terms of the Enlightenment. And the question is knowledge is power? And that got me into something that I haven't. This is now probably 35 years ago. And I used to sell books at science fiction conventions and international medieval conferences, pretty much all over the place. I even went to England a couple times. And I remembered one of my late customers, guy that died way too young, used to talk to me about H.P. Lovecraft. He's a very dark fantasy writer and responsible for a whole genre. And I remembered the guy's name was Jeff Ford, and he gave me this quotation which has hung in my mind probably, well, since he made it, and since he reported it to me. And I want you to think about this in terms of suturing and suturing time. What we're really doing now is the first spark that happens is a conversation 35, maybe even 40 years ago. And now I'm taking it to use it for another thing because that which was a literary creation it's almost like it's sneaking under the door, like making our reality or something like that. Now, the other thing I want to do when I do this is sometimes the world seems like a pretty dark place, but I have a 9-year-old friend, and I was in a position where they were asking me about what I did. And so I explained to them that one of the things I was working on was the question of the failure of the Enlightenment and something William Faulkner had said. And I've only read one or two William Faulkner stories, and the one I read 62 years ago when I was a freshman at Stevens Point made me want to puke. It was a typical English professor, loved the decadence, loved the suffering, just a terrible, terrible story. But William Faulkner said this thing which amazed me. I want to make sure that I get it right. History is not dead. It isn't even history. And I thought about that, and so I explained to my friend, and they said, "Well, you have a YouTube channel." And I said, "Yes, I do." And they said, "And you have merchandise." And I said, "Yes, I'm Ray. I'm wearing it." And then they said, "Well, we're going to get my third grade class, my fourth grade class, to watch your channels, so you get all kinds of hits, and then we can do spin-off merchandise." So what I want to say is that's people like this and their parents. You know, we just can't give up on the world just because things seem a little bit dark now. So what we're going to do is the lovely Catherine Courier is going to read this thing. Then we're going to talk about something that Putin said. and I'm going to let it hang in there. If they ever let me teach history any place, this is the kind of thing I'll want.
Sure.
Big deal about German Leopard tanks and being sent to the Ukraine, and Russia being really scared of them. But I want to tell you something. You remember General Petraeus? He commanded our units in Iraq until he made a really big boo-boo and got himself in real serious trouble and got fired. And he said, we will give Ukrainians Leopard tanks. And what? You idiot! You are commanding general, and you can't even say the name of a tank, right? Just maybe this says something about the military and the way that they try to run things. So what we want to do is look at the irony and think of the whole. And I wasn't going to tell you this, but here's what I would like to see happen. You have a bunch of young Ukrainian men, and you have a bunch of young Russian men, and they're killing each other because somebody told them to do it. And I was thinking, you know, I had listened to reports from the Ukraine, and the battlefront looks like World War I. But one of the things that the people on guard duty do is they have companion animals because it gets lonely up there. So somebody will have like a kitten in his coat pocket or something like that. So the scene that I would like to see would be either a Russian or a Ukrainian throwing a note over to the other side saying, "You got any cat food? We'll trade it for vodka." And actually, there was a 1914 Christmas truce that happened almost like that. The Germans and the Allies were facing each other. It was quiet, and there had been no shelling for about a day, and suddenly a soccer ball comes rolling across the no man's land, and somebody stands up and doesn't get shot, and they have a soccer game, and the truce lasts for a while. So in these shades of darkness, and in our darkest hour, we have to have hope and redemptive truth. I would have more to say, and I'll continue, but I'm going to have Catherine read this.
Okay. In the process of thinking, this project has developed a life of its own. Among other things, it is a memorial to a few good men no longer with us, who were important in the development of my intellectual life. All in this list have passed away. I'm going to make mention of a few of them along with their birth and death dates. Let me start with Colonel Angelo Libero, 1939 to 2021, who stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, weighing 260 pounds. Angelo was an officer and a gentleman in every sense of the word, and a moral and intellectual beacon. He was also my brother's best friend of a lifetime. My late brother, John R. Caveney, 1939 to 1993, a firefighter and a lieutenant on the Madison Fire Department, devoted his life to protection and service. As a result of a fire education talk that he gave, and a brave dog named Zeus barking, my wife, Janice M. Bogstead, and my friend and editor, Catherine M. Currier, survived a house firestorm which otherwise would have cast my life into inconsolable sadness. I also want to mention Dr. Jared Lebdell, 1936 to 2021, a world-class C.S. Lewis and Tolkien scholar whose fellowship and support pulled me away from the edge of an abyss at a very dark time in my life. I also want to mention Richard C. West, 1944 to 2021, who I miss greatly as a collaborator, a colleague, and someone to whom I could always pose difficult questions. Richard was a personification of that which is good and a Catholic man. One other person appears. I don't have his birth or death dates, but he's the kind of person who brings richness to your life, sort of like a butterfly that you thought you saw. Jeff Ford was one of my best book-selling customers. Ford recited an H.P. Lovecraft quotation, which is a launching point for this paper. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live in a placid island of ignorance, in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have heretofore harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or free from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Thinking about the unthinkable is H.P. Lovecraft rejecting the Enlightenment and contesting the idea that knowledge is power. Knowledge, in fact, becomes the force of terror. What got my attention about this quotation was Lovecraft made his pronouncement in the middle of the 1930s at the height of the worldwide Great Depression. It's fair to say that he was not a technological optimist. Richard West directed me to something in Winston Churchill's finest hour speech, which countervails Lovecraft's pessimism. The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our Europe. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour. My attention is to use Churchill's words, demeanor, and perseverance to defend the Enlightenment, because the descent into darkness that Lovecraft brings to our attention is almost naive in its ability to express an exponential increase in the things we must endure if we are to remain human looking toward the second quarter of the 21st century. It's been nearly 100 years since Lovecraft formulated his quotation, and a little over 14 months since we produced our program. Covert existential threats to our existing world on our YouTube channel, Surfing Time. Those last 14 months are integral to my lived experience. A contingent benefit of my project is that I'm honored to work with some very bright and promising public intellectuals. The theme of my essay will be existential threats crawling out of the rocks of our imagination into the world of existential reality of our lived experience, in which existence comes first and precedes essence. And the overt threats are articulated on a planetary level, lest Earth suffer the fate of the planets Krypton or Mars. Some disturbing things have worked their way into our language. One of them is the term Anthropocene, which is used by some to describe the geological epoch which humanity occupies, in which humanity is the dominant planet-shaping force. My intent is to adopt an Archimedean perspective on the last couple hundred years of Western history, from the inception of Malthusian economics to the perspective of Ukrainian freedom fighters. From a non-Archimedean perspective, they are fighting for their national heritage from the standpoint of standing guard over a frozen garbage-filled trench, wondering if Putin, intoxicated by a fabricated history of Russia as a great power, will press the button that creates the mushroom cloud above Kyiv. Then, through an exchange of nuclear weapons so necessary to validate the concept of mutually assured destruction, we will watch humanity tumble into the open pit. Somehow, the formulation of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche comes to mind as he admonishes us on the thread of staring into the abyss too long. You may find it staring back at you. Additionally, he reminds us to be careful in our fight with monsters, that we do not become monsters ourselves.
Well, that's it. One of the, do you have any questions, Brock, or anything you want to interject? Because I can continue with a couple things. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead and continue. There's been a couple points where the Skype's been cutting in and out, and so maybe and we'll see if it's a bit more stable. But I think we got enough that I think there's a lot of good stuff. So I think people will still benefit. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, I want to say a little bit about H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells wrote War of the World, The Time Machine, and he was one of the first writers to sense that though the early 20th century and late 19th was a really good time if you had the right connections, that it could be a very bad time, and facing certain aliens, we might be like the dodo birds that we made extinct, any more than the dodo birds could peck us to death, we couldn't survive against the Martians. And H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill loved H.G. Wells, read everything about him, and Churchill actually got two ideas from science fiction. And this is really weird. In 1902, H.G. Wells wrote a story called Land Ironclads. And an ironclad, is a ship. And this was like a ship on land that could obliterate anything on a battlefield. And later, when the front was stalled on the Western Front, Churchill brought forth his tank project. And if something like several hundred tanks were used, not properly to actually make a difference, but they could have been. But that was the idea that the World War II Blitzkrieg was based on, that the battlefield was going to become such a horrible place, nobody could resist it. And H.G. Wells also wrote something in 1911 called The World Set Free. And in that, Wells envisioned an atomic bomb. It's an atomic bomb. And several American physicists passed on to Churchill, who passed on to Roosevelt, that something like that was possible. Now, here is my thing that really surprised me. First of all, this may be embedded in this with no tags on, I can say, there were some reasons for using the atomic bomb to end the Second World War. And without it, my wife's father would probably have been killed in the invasion of Japan. I'm not advocating nuclear war, and it's a very difficult and complex issue. But it's interesting to say that when Churchill was aware of the development of the atomic bomb after he was voted out of Parliament, it was amazing. Basically, England effectively won the Second World War, and they thanked Churchill by voting him out of office. But in any case, initially, he thought, well, we have the atomic bomb and the Russians don't. Let's threaten those bastards and make them do what we want. And then Russia had the atomic bomb, and he said, oops. And then, while he was prime minister, the hydrogen bomb was developed. And the fusion bomb is like 1,000 times more powerful. Some of the tests were really terrifying. And Churchill thought, well, maybe the only thing that will keep us alive is mutually assured destruction. If they use it, we're going to use it, and we're both going to be dead. And so let's try to maintain that. And he came up with that idea at 81 years of age. And some of that came from an early 20th century science fiction writer. I'm going to transition to something else. I know I'm kind of doing what I do here, but I've been wrong about two things. I was wrong about Putin, and I was wrong about Trump. Well, I was wrong about Trump because I didn't because I critiqued his policy. Except it looks like he was wrong to weaken NATO. It looks like a number of the things that I thought were foolhardy, that Putin was in fact a real threat, and he was an aggressor who, if was encouraged, would not stop. So Kathy got me involved with the writings of an intellectual named Timothy Snyder, who talked about Putin's ideological base. And what Putin really is a Christian fascist. He calls himself Christian. And it's his philosophy that when God made everything, God was not omnipotent. God couldn't do everything. And so it was the job of the fascist leader to go in and finish up what God had torn asunder, and nothing else mattered. And there is a possibility that that's what's motivating Putin and his Ukraine policy. So the people who are in those trenches, anything to keep the mushroom cloud from happening. And yet, if we say anything and say, well, just surrender, we can't surrender because we're going to be destroyed. So if we had a great graphic capability for this channel, what I would have happen is that I would have two scorpions perched on the edge of a very long straight edge razor and say, that's the world in which we have to work. I'm going to say something else nice that I'm going to get in trouble for in certain circles. Some friends of mine went to something called the Creation Experience. And it's a biblical museum and kind of like a theme park. And it's got dinosaurs and it's got biblical scenes and stuff. And I thought about that for a second. And I thought, well, I don't exactly believe this. And I'm actually closer to intelligent design than you might think. And I'm not necessarily going to argue about it. But the idea of social Darwinism, where you succeed by tooth and claw, and capitalism is the best system because it's the most competitive, and to win is to be the toughest guy. And I say, yeah, over a radioactive wasteland and a stinking cesspool of a planet. I'll take the peaceful kingdom any day. So I just, what I mean by this is that groups like Mike Pence, I mean, people, are contemptuously, rightfully contemptuous. What do they call those Republicans? You've got the rhinos and the Make America Great Republicans and stuff. But nevertheless, Pence did his job when he had to. And I can tell you, going back to this idea of history being not history, what happened in January 6th, 2021 was very much like what happened in Munich in 1923 when the Hitler coup was just barely aborted. And well, I'm one of the few people who has actually read Mein Kampf. And basically what Mein Kampf says, because the Nazis are a superior race, they deserve to kill all other inferior races and take what they mean. And we had a chance to see that go in effect. where the state becomes the ultimate expression of anything, and that takes precedence out of any suffering that might happen. And Putin is coming very close to that sort of a doctrine in the way he's thinking about Russian expansion. And what I see is the rest of us who aren't like that got to make some kind of a coalition, got to make a deal. Because in the 1930s, the French socialists would not cooperate with the French right bourgeoisie, and they all ended up being controlled by Hitler. So I'm saying, what do we say is we have to resist the way we have to resist. And some of this is due for the 9-year-olds that I'm hoping are going to promote my YouTube channel. Well, I know that's kind of a hard act to follow, isn't it? Oh, I will say one other thing. I will give Putin his irony. There's this big deal about the Leopard tanks, as Petraeus would say. And Putin said, well, the last time Germany sent tanks into Russia, it didn't go very well. And of course, he's talking about Operation Barbarossa. And I could talk for hours on that, but I'm not going to.
Good thing we're not living 80 years in the past, right?
It's a good, yeah. I think Gandalf says that in The Lord of the Rings. It's terrible to have to live in these times. Roosevelt said the same thing. Yeah, we would be conscripted, and if we were and if we're captured, they just let us starve to death. You know, neither side took prisoners. And what I mean by that is Lovecraft's ability to imagine the horrific pales in the true nature of the horrific. You know, I mean, as I say, I'm not necessarily going to go there, but I think my job is to kind of do what I can in the time I've got.
No, it's I enjoyed reading that, what Kathy read, but I had read it, by email that you sent me, and it was really fascinating. So, it's really good food for thought. It's just it's interesting. I hope you keep going with it.
Well, I hope I won't ask you to do anything, but you're on the project team if you want. Well, you're helping me promote. I mean, you're already contributing to me doing this. And this guy that I'm talking about, Timothy Schneider, on Monday I'm going to try to call. He's world famous. He's got a publication list 100 items long, but he does history of the manners. And I'm going to see if we can get him on our YouTube channel. What the hell? For the 9-year-olds, right?
Yeah. Yeah, if we can overcome the technological barriers here that I've been experiencing. It's supposed to get better every year, right? This technology, and it kind of
Moore's law when we need it, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah. I also wanted to say is if you'll notice when I do this video, I have new teeth. and I can now read a screen again because I've had cataract surgery.
Yeah, like you're reverse aging there, with Benjamin Button or something, and now you got the bionic parts, and it's like you're aging in reverse here.
Well, I'm going to give credit to a woman who used to head the philosophy and religious studies department, and I was kind of a bad boy in her classes and stuff. I guess this is sort of an apology to her. She's retired now, but she was an emergency room nurse, and she had seen enough of that she decided it would be a lot better to be a philosophy professor in terms of the kind of demand that you have to face in the real world. But she had been part of a team, and she talked about working with good doctors and making them so. But she said, it's hard to find a medical innovation that's not based on something that happened in Nazi Germany. Some technological innovation because the Germans before the Nazis had probably the best science in the world. God, I just, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna be careful what I say here, but now there's an ethical question, you know. We're not going to talk about it here, but maybe sometime we will.
Yeah, you're cutting out again. This goddamn Skype. We're gonna come.
Well,
Oh,
maybe we should cut
yeah,
out.
it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Would you be willing to do more of this later when we get a better, maybe in a couple?
Yeah. We'll try next time. What we'll do is we'll try Google Meet. Better. I used it with a guy the other day and it worked well. So
Yeah.
hoping it'll work. So yeah, do we want to sign off quick and then we'll continue the
Yeah.
story?
Yeah. Okay, we can sign off.